Thank you for thinking of me as part of the series. I think it would be a lot better if most of this is a bit of a Q&A, but I'll just, as you said, introduce a little bit who I am, what my work is, and maybe a few highlights from the COVID-19 response, just to get the conversation starting. So my name is Irem, and I'm originally from Turkey, and I've been living in New York for the last 4 years. I actually studied law and then did a master's in human rights law, but then did a bit of a career switch when I joined UNFPA as an innovation fellow. And since then, I've actually stayed on with the organization, and I'm the focal point for youth leadership and participation at our headquarters. I usually joke to people saying like now I'm doing EYP like professionally for life, and I think there are actually a lot of similarities in terms of how EYP encourages civic participation and leadership development for social change, and me doing that in my professional capacity. So in a more concrete way, this might be that I might be working a lot on leadership development for youth leaders, individuals, but also on capacity development for youth organizations and youth networks. Similarly, at the UN level, we often have international global processes, and I usually play a role in trying to make sure that these opportunities are actually meaningful and also responsive to young people's needs. So maybe a few highlights from my job. UNFPA is not like UNICEF or WHO, so some of you might not have heard about it before. It is the United Nations Population Fund, and I know that the abbreviation doesn't meet the letters, but that's another long story. But in general, UNFPA is known as the Sexual and Reproductive Health Agency of the UN. But we also have a long history of working with young people, and as our tagline goes, delivering for a world where every young person's potential is fulfilled. So in general, we work a lot with women, adolescent girls, young people in general. And this is something that I actually really enjoy in terms of like the corner of the UN that I work for. Because I feel like, especially sexual and reproductive health and rights and people's decisions over their bodies is actually a prerequisite to anything else that they can do in their communities. So I can say that it's a quite feminist and often controversial mandate, which has especially come under fire as there's rising conservatism in the world. But we still try to do our best to deliver for all these different population groups in the 140 countries that we are in. So that was a little bit about UNFPA. Maybe a bit about COVID-19. I actually think it's better as a conversation, but just to say that in general, we have been working from home for almost 2 months now, maybe a little bit over that. But we are realigning a lot of our programming to fit the COVID-19 response. And in general, UNFPA is part of WHO's sister agencies. It's a sister agency to the World Health Organization, and we have a lot of like sexual and reproductive health services, midwives, etc., on the ground. So a lot of our work, especially my colleagues' work, have been about how to keep this services to continue while also being safe. Or, for example, in the Ebola crisis and some other health crises, we also had done things like contact tracing and some other things. So it's really about how to realign our resources and programming to be part of the COVID-19 response. On the youth front, we have also been working a lot through the Compact for Young People in Humanitarian Action and some other partnerships that we have to really think about what are the needs of young people in this pandemic, how can we meet them, what are the different tools that we can give. And related to my work specifically, I think an important observation is the following. So young people can play a very important role in risk communication. And when we mean risk communication, we mean communicating the right behaviors that can protect people or communities from the COVID-19 infection or help them adjust or cope better. And since typically young people are more connected to technology or more open to learning new things, they actually can play a key role in talking to their peers or their families, etc., and modeling these behaviors. And this is something that can really save lives in this context. We also think that young people do play a big role in community engagement. I don't need to explain this further, I guess, since all of you are EY peers. So when the pandemic started, one of the key things that we were thinking about is how can we leverage young people to be important in risk communication and community engagement. And one campaign that I personally have been working on day and night since then is a campaign called Youth Against COVID-19. And I know that the EYP network has also shared some tweets, etc., about this campaign also on Instagram before, so you can go and check it out. And basically, we partnered up with the technology company Prezi, which has this video technology that allows you to recreate different videos, to have a 6-episode video series that focuses on different things, on how young people are affected by COVID-19. And with different partners, we covered everything from mental health to sexual health and COVID-19 to stories of young people taking action, or gender inequalities and a gender lens on the pandemic. And we basically worked with many partners such as the EYP, but also partners from all around the world, to encourage other young people to recreate these videos, to translate these videos, and to adapt them to their local context. We launched the 6th episode last week, and by now we have more than 100 videos around the world that were recreated. We have ongoing translations in 31 languages, and we have more than 500,000 views, which is 500,000, on different platforms. So this is something that we're really excited about, and I think it really represents this idea of more of a partners-based open way of communicating about the pandemic, instead of just pushing public health messages from a top-down perspective. So if anyone is more curious about it, I would also be happy to talk to you a little bit further about the campaign. Anyways, I'll stop there and let you go on. Thank you.
So if you guys would like to ask any question, please use the function raising hand. You can find it next to participants. Not so many of us, but it's still good to use this function to have a bit more structure here.
Don't be shy.
Okay, so let's go for Nora.
I hate silence, so I was waiting for someone else to put a question first. Thanks for the presentation, Irem, and all the great work that you're doing. What do you think the role of a network like EYP can be in a time like this, also inspired by the work that you're doing and what you've seen with other youth networks that you've worked with?
Thank you, Nora. I mean, I think we're just living through a moment that requires solidarity. And I think it is also a moment where the existing of support systems or networks is more at the forefront than ever. And, you know, what is interesting for me is that, for example, I now live in New York, you know, land of capitalism in the US, but I come from Turkey, and I really see and observe how the existence of networks or safety nets can make things different for people or help people organize in different ways. And I always saw EYP as a regional and cross-country net of solidarity and support. And, you know, even professionally, I think to the days when I was taking different roles in EYP, and I think it is very remarkable that you can bring a couple of, you know, 18 to 20-year-olds together, and they can raise hundreds of thousands of euros or make really big things happen in a cross-border sense. And I think that can-do attitude, but also that a mutual trust that exists between EYPers is something to really leverage. And I think very concretely, there are ways, I'm sure, to repurpose some of EYP activities to be part of the pandemic response. And if I'm seeing it right, I'm seeing that a lot of virtual sessions are taking place, other things are happening. Another important thing is the mental health implications of COVID-19. And young people, more than many others, actually feel lonely or experience mental health symptoms in their homes. So I think just the more social, fun, and supportive side of EYP can also be a very important way to reach young people. I think another important thing is that now we're already past 2 months and the flattening the curve is taking place in many places, but things will change and they won't come back to what we thought as normal. And I think as this increasingly keeps happening, it is really important to have a vision of what a we want the new way of things to be like. And I think EYP can really have a very important voice in that. I think we will already see a bit of a shift towards dealing with the longer socioeconomic consequences of COVID-19, together with a lot of fundamental questions of what we want our societies to look like, how we want our systems to function. And I really hope that this can be a call to action to EYPers to be involved in these discussions and really take an active role in shaping what the next step is going to look like.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Let's take now a question from Saraina.
Hi everyone, good evening, and thank you Irem for that presentation and for taking the time to meet with us. Yeah, if I may just maybe pivot a little bit towards more your work with the UN in general and with UNFPA. Just to clarify, I started working for the UN in Uzbekistan a couple months ago, and I also didn't know a lot about UNFPA, but since I started, I've kind of learned about its mandate and kind of fallen in love with it. So yeah, great work. So I was wondering if, in general, for a starter in the UN, if you have any tips in general how to succeed in the organization. But then also I was wondering, I know this depends a lot on your managers and your teams, but what the room is or how you've experienced the room for innovation and new ideas. As I'm struggling a bit with how much can I bring forward myself and where do I step on someone's toes? Because yeah, there's a lot of things to watch out for, as I've learned in the UN. So that's the one side. And then if I may, the other question I have is more also youth related. I don't know how you've experienced this as an EYPer and also someone who's worked in youth issues for the past 2 years before that. While I think all EYPers have a lot of passion for this, I'm also wondering at what point should you maybe pivot away, because from my experience, it's a bit sad if you see someone who's 40 or 50 years old still working in youth issues. So I've been kind of struggling to like how to combine this continued passion with youth, but also trying to find my path outside of that kind of way without being like typecast as at once by, you know, collaborators as someone who's experienced in youth. And yeah, I wanted to know what your take on that was. Thank you, Irem.
Thank you, Serena. Amazing questions, really fundamental questions. I'll do my best to answer them. Also a random fact, but we released the COVID-19 campaign in like French, English, Arabic, Spanish, Portuguese. And then after that, there were 2 translations that came first, and one was Uzbek and the other one was Lao. So very eclectic. So just to say that our campaign also in Uzbek, if you would like to check it out. Okay, so I noted down 3 questions. I hope I got them right. One is, how can I enter the UN system? Do you have any tips for people who want an international development path? The other one is, are you able to enact innovation and, you know, implement your new ideas? Are you given space about this? And the last one is like, okay, youth related expertise is nice, but, you know, how do we pivot away for constantly being the cute young person in the room? So firstly, since I started in UNFP, everyone has been asking me, how can I answer? Are there some tips? I'll be very honest. I think it is a very, very kind of chance related and difficult path of entry in general international development. My path really started with me applying for this innovation fellowship that UNFPA has, and then from then on through certain things I stayed on as a consultant, and then at some point a staff position opened and I applied for it and I got that job. With that said, often, especially if you're trying to start at headquarters, it is years of uncertainty in employment. If you're a consultant, which I was for 1.5 years, there's no health insurance, there's no paid days off. There's basically just a lot of irregularity and lack of security in that path. Along with, like, basically UN is a reverse pyramid, as I say, so it's very top heavy and very light on the bottom, which means that you might also just, you know, be there in different capacities as an intern, as a consultant, etc., for a very long time, and then find that there are no new positions opening up for you. So I think it's very hard to say right out of university, oh, I want to be there in, you know, the global headquarters or something, and then really make it happen. So this was the more dire part of the scenario. With that said, I see that in the system itself, especially with the UN reform talks and Youth 2030, there is a renewed interest in youth participation. And I see that many agencies have different schemes to get and attract young talent. UNDP has one. UNFPA has done youth fellowships for a very long time, which I think is a very good way to enter. And similarly, there is the UN Volunteers, which is the UNV program, which I think is a generally good way to enter the UN system. With that said, with many UNV placements, you will probably start at a country office or a regional office and not in headquarters. Even though I started in New York and have been here since, I think there is actually a big plus to starting in the country offices and then coming to the global level if you're interested. In my case, because I had done a lot of local and regional projects for almost 10 years in youth participation, I personally think that I still had the perspective and the relevance to how youth participation works. But it's kind of difficult to, be in your ivory tower in headquarters and claim some sort of expertise and relevance to certain ideas. So to those people who are younger who ask me, how do I pave my way to the UN? I always say, do things in your local context on something that you are actually passionate about, and that will be your biggest asset when it becomes the time to have a professional role in the UN system. So I don't think it's necessarily about an internship here, internship there. I think it's a lot more eye-catching if you're able to say, this is what I did in EYP and here is the impact that I had regardless of my position. And one last thing I would like to also say is that a lot of your countries might have JPO programs, which is a junior program, official programs, in which case your national state would be co-funding your existence in the UN. If you have a JPO program, I think that's also a better way to enter the UN system. With that said, the average age for a P2, which is what I am, is 37. I became a P2 at 27, which I think was the youngest in UNFPA at the time. But in general, like, you are dealing with governments when you're in the UN, and it is a bit of a mid-career move in many ways. So I think it's also perfectly okay to plan for this as something you do in your early 30s and not something that you do fresh out of university. I had actually worked in the private sector as a lawyer, and I already had a master's before I started my job. So, I think being in the youth field makes it a lot more easier for me to be younger, but I wouldn't say that is the norm across all expertise areas. That was a long, but I hope comprehensive answer. You asked me, like, do I feel like my innovation and new ideas are being taken on board? As you said, I think this is really about the team and the supervisor that you have. I've been very, very lucky to be part of this awesome team. We even work on Slack, which is, how unusual is that for the UN? And I have a really great boss who is Swedish, and my direct supervisor is Luxembourgish. And I think the general European Western leaning ways of working made it a bit easier for me to adapt at the very first days. And in general, I was given a lot of space and freedom over what to do in my corner of things, which is the reason why I enjoy my particular position a lot. I don't think that is the experience across the board. Like in any large organization, your team and your supervisor will have an immense impact on how your professional experience is. And I mean, I think that, like, I see a lot of people growing quite obsessed with like an EU or UN path. I mean, I personally remain quite idealistic. I don't think I would do anything just to remain in the system, even though it is obviously a high status and nice job. I think that, it can also kill your soul if you don't end up in the right corner of the system. So whatever path you have, and if you're making choices between different UN posts, I think it's really important to try and do some research and really trust your gut feeling about the people that you're going to work with. But I mean, with that said, another important thing is that, for example, now in UNFPA, we have a young professionals network called Tangerine. And we work a lot on youth leadership and participation internally, and general empowerment, intergenerational leadership, and so on. So I see that there's actually a lot more push in the UN system for managers to be open to new ideas, for them to be better at leading, people who are younger than them, pay attention to gender roles, etc. So I would say that since I entered the UN system in 2016, when I compare it to now, there has been a greater push for innovation, openness, change, And I think that's a good thing for us. Lastly, about the youth-related thing, I mean, yeah, I think this is something that we all face. And like personally, I also don't want to be the person who's like 45 with like maybe 2 kids and still talking about how young people should be empowered. So my personal plan is to actually go more towards my background, which is human rights law. With that said, I work with a lot of people who are in their 40s and they are experts on youth-related issues. So we also need to see that like EYP type activities and some other things might be a lot more about, you know, your general involvement and activist spirit. But there's also a demographic reality in terms of adolescents and young people, and there are very different medical needs, social needs, other things that relate to adolescents and young people. Similarly, there are very specific and technical things about, for example, young people in the context of youth, peace and security or humanitarian action. So, you know, just because it is kind of, you know, youth work, it doesn't mean that it is less of a technical subject. I'll tell you an anecdote. So I used to be an arbitration lawyer and I started doing youth leadership and participation. And I grew really frustrated thinking that any person who had a like teenager son or daughter would think that they're able to talk to my expertise, or, you know, anyone who read the newspaper in general thinks that they can talk about education and social things very easily and be an expert on it. But that is not the case. There's actually a lot of science and evidence-based and a lot of thinking and experience that goes into understanding how to create sustainable networks, how to do capacity development and so on. So I think on one hand, we should obviously grow in different ways if that's what we want, but we also should stand up for the fact that youth empowerment is also a technical issue that could be someone's work for life. All right.
Thanks a lot. That was an extensive answer. Thank you for taking the time. Very useful.
Of course. Yeah, if you have any follow-up questions, do ask.
Thank you, Irem, for your great answer, and Serena for your question. And the next question is from Julia. So, yeah, Julia, you are unmuted, I guess.
Hi, thank you so much, Irem. This is wonderful.
Hi, good to see you.
I just had a question. Well, I have lots of questions really, but the first question was just about, I think it's something that often EYPers ask and struggle with figuring out how to explain or how to translate the amazing skills and experiences they've had within the organization and how to bring that into their professional life, or more specifically at the beginning of their professional careers, and how to really, I don't want to use the word sell, but how to really explain and show the value in the skills that we've picked up and experiences we've had.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And I think like a lot of us, including me, probably first start with the definition of EYP and say, you know, we were part of this European organization for political engagement, etc. But what I have found over time is that I think the interpersonal skills and general feedback-based personal development combined with facilitation skills, moderation skills, training skills are just very transferable from EYP. And I think that also is what sets it apart from many other organizations. And for me, like, interestingly, like, I am also an MUNer. I was, you know, really involved in MUN in Turkey for a long time. I was a women delivery young leader, etc. So like during my, you know, 10 years of involvement in EYP, I also dabbled in a lot of different networks. And I can like really say that the only thing that really fundamentally changed who I was EYP. And that's why, for example, in my interview for my current job, EYP was one of the cases that I presented as part of the interview. So I think it's really important to not just say, oh, I was part of this political organization, but really talk about what EYP is in terms of non-formal education. And I think this emphasis on moderation, taking initiative, facilitation, interpersonal skills, this is really important. And I think these would be the keywords I would present to any person that is trying to better understand what we did in EYP. Also, one strategy that I find really useful is to just like go for wow numbers or things. Like when you say, oh, I was 19 and we raised 300K as the finance director for the IS in here, or you say, you know, there were more than 300 young people coming from this many countries. Like, I feel like these things give it a bit of a flair, just compared to a flat, oh, I was a member of this network type presentation. Well, I hope this was useful.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Rem, for your answer. Do we have any more questions?
Oh, as we're waiting for more questions, something I forgot to add is, I think something that was really important, especially for international development work, is the ability to work in cross-cultural environments and work with people from very different backgrounds. And I think saying that from a young age, you regularly worked with people who came from all over the continent is a very powerful testament to that. So I think that cross-cultural working element is also something that is really important. All right, now another question.
Yes, now we can go to Lika.
Hello, Irem and everyone.
Hi, good to see you. I last saw you in Nairobi.
Yes. Thank you everyone for such a nice conversation. And yeah, so basically I think that my question is more related to the first part. I was a bit late. Like I think that everyone knows that we are now kind of developing the new international strategy for the network. And you most of the time have a very broad connection with a lot of youth-led organizations and a lot of projects with different topics covered, and so on and so on. And I'm just interested, what do you think how EYP on international level can incentivize their social and role in sustainable development generally, and in political debates and in social lifestyle of people in Europe, and how you see, of course, it's a very broad topic in terms of international strategy, but as you have this like broad background in EYP as well, just a bit of how you envision EYP, let's say, in future, just, just some visionary, a very small, I don't know, idea you have about EYP, what it can be in 10 years, let's say, how you see that happening. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Wow, a big question to try and grapple with. I mean, as I said, I've been in EYP, away from EYP for a few years, so obviously, just take it as my 2 cents as an long ago EYPer, I guess. But I've been working with a lot of youth organizations and networks around the world, but I think I've also seen how the UN, for example, looks at these different youth organizations, or where the gaps are. And I always kept saying EYP has so much to offer, and it can play such a central role and be up there in terms of the networks that we see with a voice and presence in the international arena. And I see that in many ways we are quite internal looking. And I do understand that, because also when I was an EYPer, I always said this was my second high school. So, it's always about this session, that session, who's going to be that, am I going to be a chair? Like, you just have a whole universe to be in. So it's kind of, I think, expected that a lot of the members of EYP are not necessarily looking to see, how does this transfer to sustainable development goals? Or how does this translate to having a broader voice in other international processes? With that said, since I started my job, I've also been pulling EYP quite a lot into these things. Like, for example, the delegation to the Nairobi summit last year, I was coordinating the youth leadership and participation for Nairobi, and I was really pushing to say, like, we need EYP to also be there as a big regional voice. I think I have 3 main points on this. One is, like, I know that we famously say that we are apolitical. At the same time, EYP stands for certain values, and which comes with a certain worldview. So I think having a voice as a youth constituency in key processes globally and also at the European level should be EYP's priority. There are so many consultations and other policy processes where we look to youth organizations to give us inputs. And I think what is important there is that you might have a lot of networks, but they might not have the depth of engagement to actually, give you really genuine input. And I think what is, very important with EYP is that a lot of the alumni have been there for years. once you go through a committee work in any session, you actually like deeply engage with the subject. So I think a lot of what comes out of EYP could be repurposed as a political input on behalf of a youth constituency. For example, what I'm saying in terms of COVID-19, like what is the EYP network's vision for what the world should look like and what the political, financial, social priorities should be as we recover from this pandemic. Like I think that position paper should exist, should be there far and wide, because EYP has the legitimacy and the power to do this. I think another important thing is non-formal education. So there is a big agenda that is emerging on non-formal education and trying to recognize education that doesn't necessarily happen in schools, but is still very important. And non-formal education is important both for creating values-based leaders that will take their countries forward, but it's also important because we talk a lot about 21st century skills, and these skills are usually not given by our formal education systems. As a professional, I think I've tapped into what I learned in EYP as much as what I learned in, I don't know, 17 years of schooling or something. So I think really thinking about and qualifying what are the skills and competencies that we offer to people who are EYP members, and pushing forward EYP as a very big non-formal education platform in Europe is also very important. And last year in December, we had the first ever non-formal education forum in Rio. And we see that, for example, big organizations such as Scouting, Girl Scouts, Duke of Edinburgh Award, etc., like those big giants are increasingly going into non-formal education, which will mean that this will start becoming a priority for governments and policymakers too. And if there is increased funding and interest, then could EYP become part of this landscape of non-formal education? And the last thing is, I think it's very easy to form youth organizations. And, I've also been there. I was a Women's Delivery Young Leader. I was a Girls 20 Summit Leader, etc. And it's so easy to be 18 and like go and start your own little project and have a little charity that lasts 3 years. And you don't really think about what it will be long term. So we have a proliferation for young leaders and a proliferation for one-man shows of youth organizations. But we increasingly have less and less youth networks. And I think in there, EYP has a lot to offer in sharing its know-how about how to create such a robust network, which has depth and breadth at the same time. And I see that these things don't exist in many other regions. And I wonder whether EYP could also be partnering up with different networks from other regions to share its experience building such a network. So yeah, those are my general reflections on this.
Thank you, Irem. Thank you, Lika, for your question. Do we have any more questions? Yay, Julia.
So this is just a quick one, but I'm wondering what, so you said you started in law, and I'm wondering what made you, or what drew you to the Innovation Fellowship, and maybe how did you find out about it, or what kind of steps did you take from finishing your master's and moving out into the world, I guess?
Yeah, good question. So the way it was is that I actually had some elbow contact with UNFPA even when I was in university. So I'll be anecdotal just to show that, these things are also as much chance in the way life works as planned. So I was chosen as a young leader for Women Deliver in 2013, and it was in Malaysia. It was the first time I traveled anywhere else than Europe, I think. And there I was invited to this luncheon by Malaysia's First Lady, probably because I'm Turkish and it was a Muslim situation. Anyway, and there was a guy sitting next to me who was from UNFPA, and we really got along well, and he was really interested in my work and came to my presentation where I was actually presenting a lot of things about UIP. And starting from that, I learned about what UNFPA was, and I was invited to be a contributing editor to one of their reports when I was in my senior year in university. And I also, I think, went over to one consultation that they had in New York. So that very person, Pratik, ended up being my supervisor, and now I have his position in UNFPA. So my switch from law to fellowship happened in this way. So when I graduated, I trained as a lawyer, and I entered Pinson Masons, which is a UK-based law firm. And my soul was kind of dying in this corporate thing. Like, one of our biggest clients was Shell, for example. So it was just this thing where, I felt like I was learning a lot, but I also, I was so used to being an overachiever and a good student, and I simply couldn't find any purpose in what I was doing. So I became an employee who was a little bit like, why am I working my ass off when this partner is charging $500 per hour, and my entire salary is just $1,000 or something. So I had a lot of fundamental disagreements with the setup in general, which is what prompted me to start the human rights law masters at the same time. So at the time I learned about the fellowship, I think I had a vague idea that I would be moving towards the social change or public sector space in general, even though I didn't think this would be the UN. But Pratik at the time gave me a call to say, oh, here's a fellowship and you should apply. And I think we had like 2,000 applications, and they selected 8 of us for the first cohort of the fellowship. And that's how it happened. So I think it's good to, in general, like meet people as much as you can and stay in touch with them, would be my little networking tip in there.
Thank you so much. I feel like I'm also at that point now, so it's just it's nice to hear.
Yeah, I mean, like, maybe expand that a little bit. Everyone asks me like, oh, law, would you have studied it again? Do you think it's useful? You're not doing something legal anymore. I'm actually so glad that I studied law and I qualified as a lawyer. If I had to do it again, I would do it. I think there are a few things. One, it's like a certain status and something that comes with it. And at a time when I was trying to make up for the fact that I'm young and a woman, I think the fact that I was a member of the Istanbul Bar definitely made a difference, especially in the US context. But also, I think law gives you this like way of looking at the world, do normative thinking, and do problem solving in a way that is applicable to everything else that you do. So, I don't think it's such a bad investment after all.
Thank you so much. Great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions?
I might have one question. That's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so earlier you said you were doing different things in local contexts before working for the UN permanently. And I was just wondering if you did any interesting projects apart from taking part in UIP and MUN events. And if so, could you maybe tell us something more about it? Especially, I'm talking about your college years, since I'm currently in college and I'm just kind of looking for something, good to do. I don't know, get inspired, Just wondering, maybe you had something that you want to share.
Yeah, I mean, my general interest in women's rights and, stuff that I work on now was also a little bit of a family thing, because my mom works on HIV/AIDS. So when I was in high school at the time, like HIV/AIDS projects, etc., was a really big thing. So it first started with me like volunteering in some of these projects. And I think that's how I got into the like more Girls 20 Summit Women Delivery type circuit. And I did like have a similar adolescent girls summit in Turkey, and did some more like Turkish context women's rights projects, which I recommend and not recommend at the same time. I think on one hand, it is good to be doing something that is more related to your local community and country. At the same time, if I could do it again, I think I would link up with an existing NGO and program instead of starting my own thing with a couple of friends and then ditching that once, it gets too much. With that said, like, I think something that is important to explain is at the time when I started EYP in Turkey and also MUN, these were both like, they didn't have any institutional infrastructure in Turkey. So my EYP and MUN involvement was not really so much about the sessions, but like we literally took a student club and then formed an association. I was on the board of the first ever board of EYP Turkey. We did an IS for the first time. So I think a lot of what transpired from that was that like it wasn't about being a participant in sessions, but it was about setting up the network. Similarly, up until that point, EYP Turkey was just in like one private school in Istanbul, whereas I come from Ankara, and I was the first ever delegate from EYP Turkey that didn't come from Istanbul and from that private school. So we were doing a lot to like take it out of Istanbul and into other cities like Ankara, where I come from, and Izmir and so on. And similarly, MUN also was a student club. that was doing like 100 people conferences, and then we started an association. We got government funding. We took it to different cities in the country. So I think like what is important is to like stick to something and show how you grow and take incremental leadership roles. And for me, I was lucky for that to be EYPMUN at the time, but for you it can be anything else that is relevant and around you.
Super, thank you.
Great, thank you. And now I see here 2 hands, and I'm wondering if it's just a hand from the past that stay here. Lita?
Yes, it's from the past.
Okay.
Hands from the past, I like it.
And Nora?
Yeah, thanks first of all for all the engaging replies and questions. So I have a couple of different questions, and there are some of them are related, and some are SRHR related, and some go like hand in hand, and some are UN. I'll try to be brief. First of all, so it's a clear UN priority to work with and for young people with Youth 2030. The SDGs, ICPD, the Youth Peace and Security Agenda turning 5. What role can EYP take in implementing and working with UN partners? Because, for example, now we're working with UNFPA and UNHCR. Second question is, in terms of SRHR, sexual and reproductive health and rights, the approach that we've taken in EYP has been very much focused on welfare, where we've set up this structure to ensure that EYP is a safe and dignified environment. It's not exactly the work that some other youth networks do that are more related to sex education and these other aspects, but more in terms of the normative and ensuring that we incentivize this clear consent culture. Is there anything we can learn in our work in improving in this area? Is there anything we can export from the work that we do, either to other youth networks or other stakeholders? And then also looking at this call, which is female majority.
Or only female, yeah.
Well, I think we have Nasha.
Oh yes, we have.
How do we both internally in EYP get more male EYPers on board with these topics, both internally in creating this culture and in getting excited and engaging in these topics, so that we make sure that we include all of our membership in this? I think those were the questions.
I mean, we could just have a webinar on this, or I could also hear from everyone on what they think, but like, let me give it a try. So first, there is a clear UN priority to work with and for young people. What can EYP do in there? Yes, I think there is a big UN priority on working with and for young people. It is also informed by the demographic reality of what's happening. I think that like the UNFPA and UNHCR partnerships, and the UNFPA one I know quite intimately, are a great example of how much EYP could be integrated into international processes, but also the priorities of different international agencies and actors can be embedded into the session system for EYP. So I think a lot more of this could be done with many more UN agencies. Also, like, as I'm revisiting this exporting the know-how point a little bit here. So I think one problem is this, right? So for many UN agencies, your region will be the region for which they don't have many resources, because we are really active and we have big budgets for, let's say, Africa or Latin America, but we basically do more policy work when it's the European context, which is natural because we're looking at more middle to high income countries. So at that point, I think that like EYP to Global South Youth Organizations and networks relationships have a lot of potential for new modalities for partnerships and a lot more for resource mobilization. For example, I was part of the quite short-lived Euro African Youth Parliament experiment back in the day. I know the Euromed things were happening back in the day. And I also understand that the network wants to focus on itself, which is perfectly okay. But I think these sort of more international collaboration modalities could be a way for EYP to have a leading role. I think in general, like being from the global north and striking that right balance when you talk on international development is quite a strategic difficulty. But I also think that you have a lot of alumni that are well placed to do that. So yeah, this is the role that EYP can play. On sexual and reproductive health and rights, I hope that it's not something that makes people go, what are you talking about and why is this relevant? I mean, I think day by day, what is important is to, like, for me and you, ICPD agenda or sexual and reproductive health and rights is a framing that makes sense and resonates. I think what also needs to be done, and EYP can do this, is to convert this and make the ties with other things that might resonate with broader groups of people, such as the Me Too movement or gender equality, or, you know, the increasingly fluid gender roles, etc. Like a lot of the things in sexual and reproductive health and rights are very political topics that have to do with people's decisions over their bodies, whether it is consent, it is contraception, it is abortion, and so on. And I think it is very important through EYP's more substantive pillar to say that this is not only about safeguarding, but it's also something that all of us, regardless of whether we're a man or a woman, should care about. And here, I think something that is perhaps relevant is, for example, our youth strategy is called My Body, My Life, My World. And I think that is what we're going for, right? Like, unless you have rights and choices over your body, you probably can't really have a say over your life, and you can't probably have a say over your world either. So I think really like putting this in the agency debate, tying it to reproductive justice and the gender movement are very important things. And, you know, sometimes we might be having a very SRHR technical discussion in a EYP session or something, but how is it that we can have these broader conversations about agency and gender and sexual and reproductive health and rights? I think that would be my question to you more than anyone else, like these people, because you know how EYP is today more than I do. And yeah, I guess getting men on board in general and the like or he for she thing is quite an important thing in EYP. I mean, like, I just think that the way EYP is, if I remember it right, can also be really progressive and forward-looking in all of these debates. Like, I think it is about going away from binary understanding of gender from everything else. Like, as the UN, we might be keeping to a little bit more of a inclusive and safe line in terms of, you know, what this is. But EYP, given the general tendencies in the region and the profile of EYP alumni, can also be going for the 2.0, right? So I think like we can also just transcend the general he for she paradigm and go for something that talks a lot about LGBTQI inclusion, abortion, like all the things that people don't want to talk about. I think those should be the things that are at the forefront of EYP's engagement. I'm actually curious, anyone else who would like to reflect on these?
Well, we have a question from Yasha. Maybe it's a direct.
Okay, yeah, so okay, in the meantime, think about it. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, I can. Yeah.
I just it's in a way a follow-up question, a little bit regarding the things that you said about EYP being progressive and also like, you know, speaking for others and things like that. Many of you probably know the Facebook groups like EYP discussions and things like that, and I agree, Nura. But there in the quarantine life, I have fallen into like reading a little bit more into the comments of them. And one thing that I have found there, and also because I come from the Balkans, or kind of the border of the Balkans, Slovenia, but in general, I've been, you know, I know a lot of people from the Balkans, and like that, there's a lot of saying how, even though we know that EYP is, you know, politically independent and does not, you know, sway in any direction or anything like that. But for instance, a very specific comment on the post about how I think it was the members platform or something should be more inclusive to all the genders. Someone said, oh, but this is a political statement because, you know, this is what the liberals think, and that this is why so many young people, especially from countries like Croatia and Serbia, I'm basically paraphrasing what the comment said, are turned away from organizations like EYP because they are too leftist or something like that. And I'm personally also struggling even in my university because I'm studying social sciences, international relations, and in Slovenia, our faculty of social sciences is always regarded as the leftist, you know? So it's kind of this, basically I'm asking kind of you, and because it's connecting to the topic that we said, how to kind of answer things that are so obviously about being inclusive and being, or at least to us, I guess, are so obviously about being inclusive and making a safe environment for everyone, when people think that it's literally just a political, you know, statement or something like that. Kind of how to answer that, basically.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that is a tough question, but well, I mean, like, I think what is important is to relate it to values and value clarification in general. And I'm not sure this is something that can be resolved just in a Facebook comment exchange, but maybe this is a lesson that we need to take in terms of what the EYP experience is like. And like something that I see in international conferences, but I also remember happening in EYP. I'll just give you an anecdote. So I was in the international conference on family planning a few years back in Rwanda, and we had a youth pre-conference type thing. And these people have applied to come to the family planning conference and like family planning advocates, etc. So you might think that they are probably a little bit more, you know, on board with the agenda in some way. And they said, okay, you know, very American facilitators too. They said, now we're going to do a value clarification exercise. So they're like, okay, if you like summer, you go to one end of the room. If you like winter, you go to the one end. So it started with very easy things like sunrise or sunset, whatever. And then it started like same-sex marriage should happen, and literally half of the room was like in the very no. And there was a quite regional thing there too, like, you know, more Christian African advocates over there, you know, Swedish people over there type thing. And then it's like sex work is work, similar thing. And I think all of the facilitators were like completely caught off guard with zero idea about how to workshop this sort of division. And it was like, yes, we all have different opinions, and let us go on with the next item on the agenda. And, you know, I wanted to scream to everyone to be like, right now we should erase the agenda, and we should spend the whole day matching these people, making sure that they have dialogues. And, you know, we should have the facilitation skills and the moderation skills to actually carry out the value clarification and conflict exercise. And like, I remember such things, you know, Turkey-Cyprus discussions would always happen in EYP. I once chaired the committee about, you know, whether women should be allowed to wear burqas in public, etc. And somehow our chairing methods were always about getting some sort of consensus without actually going too deep into people's beliefs, which is also like something good about EYP chairing. But I'm wondering whether there's a way to make these values clarification exercises come from a deep place as part of being an EYP delegate. Because I think unless you have some like honest conversations and exchange between people from different opinions, it is very hard to just say, no, EYP believes in this, and think that everyone will be on board. So that would be my general comment. But yeah, I mean, there are certain non-negotiables, and I think being pro-Europe, pro-multilateralism, etc., does come with its own, you know, values and political positions for EYP. But like, this is not just a political thing. This is also a very personal and values-based thing, and I think all of the leaders in EYP should be well equipped to actually deal with that.
Thank you, Irem. Do we have any other questions left? I'm looking a bit at the time, and I have a feeling that you might be, that your lunch break is going to the end.
It's okay, I'm at home. You guys, if you have questions, I'm happy to go on, but whatever you prefer.
Yeah, but for sure, like, I think one more question should be fine. Yes,
Okay.
Julia.
But just more to say thank you so much for joining today. It's just been like such a lovely conversation, and I think especially with like I suppose it doesn't seem like almost a year, but it has almost been a year since I've been involved in EYP, and it's lovely to just reflect, I think, on all the processes, and especially to get insight from members as well who are still involved, and kind of get your response as well from having been out of EYP for a little bit. So it's just, yeah, it's been really great. I just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you for all the great questions as well. As I said, EYP always excites me, and I'm so happy to be surrounded by EYPers at any opportunity. So thank you all.